Welcome to the November edition of the Grafana Agent Community Call. Today, we're going to have a presentation from Misha, who's going to talk about Flow 101. So, with that, I'll kick it over to Misha. If there's any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat or just raise a hand, and we'll take them as they come, or after Misha gets through the presentation portion. So, with that, Misha, take it away.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm going to be going over a presentation, kind of just an introduction to Flow. It assumes a little bit of familiarity with general telemetry collection topics, but doesn't assume anything for Flow. Again, a little bit of the agent, what you might want to do, but that's about it. So that's me. I'm joined by many other people, but I'm going to be the one talking, so I get to put my face on the intro slide. So let's go over some of the core concepts of Flow. So Flow is configured using the River configuration language. It's mainly comprised of four things. We have attributes, expressions, blocks, and components, and we'll go into more detail on each of those as we go along in the presentation. So kind of those core Flow concepts, the big three are attributes, which are key value pairs that configure individual settings. We have expressions, which are used to compute the value of attributes. So that can be mathematical expressions. It can be references to other components, just literals. I mean, just the string hello would be a valid expression. It can also be standard library calls, and we'll talk a little bit about some common standard library functions that you may find useful. And blocks. And so blocks are used to group attributes together and configure components. So attributes and expressions, here are a couple of examples. As I mentioned, just a regular string is a valid attribute. File name equals env. That's a standard library call, which again, we'll get into in a second. But that's finding the $home environment variable and then concatenating it with /secret, secret.txt. Please don't actually use this. And then password equals, and that's a reference to the local.file component that's named Grafana Cloud Token, and then referencing its its content. So as I mentioned before, we have standard library functions. There's a full up-to-date list in our docs. Standard library functions are pure functions. They have no side effects, and they will always return the same output given the same input. So some of the commonly used ones, you've already seen is used to read environment variables. So another example, just fetching the Grafana Cloud Token, so to show that you can set whatever you want. There's also concat. So this is a pretty common one for concatenating lists of targets. For example, to scrape. So here again is setting targets equal to the concatenation of two different components, targets, exports. And then JSON decode, which is used to decode JSON into a flow object. So flow objects are kind of like, that what you think of in JSON. So key equals value pairs. So as an example, you could have a local file with credentials in it, and then you're JSON decoding it, and then referencing the MySQL password key. Again, not necessarily a great security pattern, but just an illustrative example. And coalesce, which is used to use a value or a default if the value that you supplied is empty. So again, maybe you could have a password in a local file, or you want to fetch it from an environment variable as a fallback. So then there are blocks. And so here's a couple of examples. One of these is a rule block, which is used for relabeling. The other one is basic authentication. So you can see that in each case, there are a series of attributes that are kind of encased into curly braces. So that's the classic pattern of blocks. So some blocks can have labels. So that would look something like, rule and then a string, and that would be a named block. So blocks are groups of attributes. There are a few standalone blocks in the agent. So there's the HTTP logging, tracing, the HTTP logging and tracing blocks. Each configures a part of the agent itself. So these are kind of like special case ones, but for the most part, they're used to configure components. And so as I just mentioned, there are components. And so components are blocks that have labels attached to them. And they're the things that actually, they really do the stuff that you want to do with the agent. And so to give two examples, you have local.file, which, as you might be able to guess, reads the contents of a file on the local disk. And so this one is named gcloud creds. So you would always reference it by its fully qualified name, which would be local.file.gcloud_creds. And then it exports something called content. And so that's how you would reference that. But the fully qualified name is the component name, the full one, and then also the label that you assign to it. So in this case, it has two configuration options: the file name, which is what you're reading, and is secret. That is specifically for hiding values in a user interface, which we'll see in a second. The second example is using Prometheus.relabel. It's named default. Again, you can name these whatever you want. They just can't conflict with anything else. It takes a forward to and then a series of rules. And so this was intended to show that you can have multiple of the same block in some cases. Reference the docs. If it says it's a list, then you can use multiple of them. And so in this case, Prometheus.relabel, this component, it evaluates the rules in top-down order. So again, components are blocks that have name labels and perform functions. We have a full list of reference documentation, but they can be used, for example, to run exporters in the agent, perform service discovery, scrape and relabel metrics and logs, and collect traces with OTel components. So we embed a lot of OTel stuff. And a lot more. There are things outside of the kind of general pattern of, like, receivers, processors, and sinks. So there. And we have, other things potentially planned in the future to add more functionality. You can fetch things from remote HTTP endpoints, stuff like that. So components are largely grouped by their names. So the Prometheus.star components are pretty much all things Prometheus. The Prometheus.exporter.star components are all things Prometheus exporters. Loki.star components are all things Loki. I'll speed up a little bit. Loki.source.star components are all about retrieving logs from targets. And the OTel call.star components are all things OTel. So that's just kind of to say that we have a really long list of reference documentation, but generally speaking, me as a consumer of this, I read our own docs all the time. If I'm looking for something in particular, I'm usually kind of looking or filtering for this in our docs page. And so data pipelines are really that, generally you can have more than one component. One component in a flow configuration probably isn't going to do much. In fact, it won't. So you generally want to connect these components together. That's what's really kind of nice. You can have composable pipelines where they're, data is flowing from one to the other, processing, you can fetch from various different places. And you do this by linking their arguments and exports. And so arguments are those attributes that you use to configure the components. And exports are something that I've mentioned a couple times in the past, but it's values that that components may make available to other components. So not every component has an export. So in some cases, they don't have values that can be referenced. But again, this would all be in the documentation. And as you kind of get a feel for how things work and have used components, you'll kind of see which ones tend to have exports and which ones don't. So here's kind of just a basic example, and you could even theoretically take this and run it yourself. I mean, of course, replacing your particular username and URL for Grafana Cloud, and of course setting a gcloud metrics token or any password. You could do it with a raw string for testing. You could also replace the endpoint with just a local Prometheus that has remote write enabled. But to go kind of top down, so the first component that we have is this Prometheus.exporter.unix, and it's named localhost. And so that is node exporter. And just a slight choice, we named it Unix just because Node kind of might have been confused with Node.js. So this component doesn't have any arguments that we've supplied. So you can see that those two curly braces are empty. There are lots of default values for Node Exporter. And so this is essentially just not overriding any values. And so the Unix exporter, so the Prometheus.exporter.unix component, exports a targets list. And so you can see that in the next component, the Prometheus.scrape named default. So its targets argument is set to the export of the previous component, its targets, and it's forwarding to the Prometheus.remote-write.gcloud's receiver. So Prometheus remote write components, they export a value named a receiver, and that's what you can send effectively Prometheus metrics to. And so if you kind of look at the flow of data, the Prometheus.scrape is scraping targets that are exposed by the Prometheus exporter.unix, and it's forwarding those metrics onto the Prometheus remote write. And so for more complicated use cases, slightly more complicated, you could probably see the Prometheus.scrape component forwarding metrics to a Prometheus.relabel, and then that Prometheus.relabel forwards the now relabeled metrics to the remote write. But you can get, much more complicated pipelines. And if you're monitoring systems, you probably will, and it'll evolve. So wouldn't it be nice if you could see this in a UI, though? You can. So the Grafana agent comes and it has comes with a UI, and so you can see the list of components. You can also see that graph. So again, this can get more complicated. Each of these is clickable, so you can actually click through and see something like this. So this is the Prometheus.scrape default that we saw earlier. You can see all of the arguments that were passed into it, and so you can even see that list of targets that is coming from the Unix exporter. So you can see all kinds of interesting internal details, the metrics path, the component name, component ID, address, the instance value, and the job. And so there's also debug info. So some components have much more detailed debug information that you can get. So as you can see here, you can see when the last scrape happened and the duration of it. Again, you can refer to the docs to see which ones have debug info and what it might be. So there are a couple of hands-on examples. Shameless self-promo. I have a repository, which is kind of a flow by example. This is going to be probably migrated into our docs soon. Only thing that I'm kind of waiting on is whether some of the more complicated examples make more sense in a GitHub repo. So I'm trying to work through how to add that to docs. But these are intended to be beginner-friendly examples that you can follow along with and demo. It has a couple of it has like a Docker Compose that you can use. So it spins up Prometheus and Loki and Grafana, and so then a lot of the examples actually refer to that and will like kind of get you through getting metrics in and then querying things. And that's actually my entire presentation.
Awesome. Thanks, Misha. Yeah, I see the claps. I think they're well deserved. I got a couple things maybe we can hit on if you don't mind, Misha. I'm gonna send. Oh, I didn't have it. The link to local file. If you stop presenting, I could present it too.
Oh yeah.
But I just wanted to kind of see if you could kind of connect the dots for us in our documentation where you would find the exports and the arguments in our docs, so that you know what you're referencing and how it works.
Sure. I'll present my entire screen again. Again, apologies for the infinite window. I'll try to skip it. So let me actually just click through on the link that you provided. Just start there. So again, this is like the reference documentation. So this is the kind of the detailed information. Wow, that is a very unfortunate place to put that. This is kind of the detailed information on a component, all of its arguments, its exported fields, information about component health. So that's something I didn't really talk too much about in the presentation, but components will kind of signify their health as to essentially there's three different values. There's three different possible ones. There's healthy, unhealthy, and unknown at the moment. Generally speaking, you won't see unknown too often. That's going to be things like remote.htp, where the health is, well, kind of up in the air until it's done its first fetch. But generally, you'll see healthy and unhealthy. Most components will say essentially unhealthy if they're given an invalid configuration. There are a couple of components that have more dynamic health. The remote.htp stuff that I mentioned earlier actually being an example. So if the fetch fails, then it will mark itself as unhealthy. But to go over it, if we're looking at the local.file, you have a description at the top level. And so it'll generally describe what the component can do. Then the usage is, it is an example. However, it only shows the required field. So if you see file name is a required field and it's required here, So this usage, you should be able to copy paste it and replace the values with something valid, and it should work by itself. But keep in mind that again, this is not exposing all of the values, but rather just the required ones. So then following that, you can see kind of a list of all the arguments, their name, their type, a description of each. These are supposed to be very short. You might be able to find more information on them based on the examples, or maybe even there are oftentimes comments underneath here if there are particular things that you should keep in mind when using these arguments, the defaults, and then whether it's required. Like I said, there may be some more information in here about all of these arguments. The exported fields one is a good one to keep in mind. Again, this is how you chain together components, is through their exports. Yeah. So again, their name, their type, and a description of them. And again, secret, the purpose here is that it will prevent things from showing up in the UI. So if something is marked as a secret, it will just show up as secret in the user interface. Yeah. And in this case, the content field will have the secret type if the is secret argument is true. Again, component health. I guess in this case, the local file will be reported as healthy whenever the watched file is read successfully. So I'm assuming if the file is ever deleted, then it'll be marked as unhealthy. And then you'll find example, which is copy pastable, and then you could theoretically use it. And so this is what I meant earlier, where there's a long list of components, maybe to be reorganized at some point in the future. But for now, this is the list. Generally speaking, again, if you're looking for service discovery, you're going to be looking for anything that starts with discovery. So again, we have things for service discovery from Azure, Console Agent, DigitalOcean. I'll skip a couple, Lightsail. There's a lot here. These are actually, generally speaking, these are all of the service discoveries that Prometheus currently supports. Then we have, things like a Faro receiver. There's local.file match. So this is also one that may be interesting to some folks. This is for matching globstar or glob style pattern matching of files on the local disk. And so you might use this, for example, if you're trying to find logs. And so again, we can take a look at some examples. This is that local.file match. This is matching things in the temp/logs directory, anything underneath that, and anything ending in .log. Then we have a loki.source.file component named files. Its targets is the exported targets thing from local.file match, which again, let's actually take a look at that. So local.file match, if we look at its exported fields, it exports targets, which is a list from map to string. And this is kind of where I meant this is a list, right? And so if we then look at loki.source.file, let's find that, source.file, its targets argument is also a list of map to string. And so then that kind of naturally begs the question, what if you had two different components that each export this? That's where that concat standard library function comes in play. That takes two lists and smashes them together. So that way you can have multiple components all forwarding to a single loki.source, sorry, not forwarding, but you can have a loki.source.file that references the target's exports of multiple. So I mean, silly example, but imagine if you had multiple of these, you would do a concat of all of their targets exports. And then again, you could forward them all to the same loki.write. You could also forward to multiple different ones. So as an example, if you had Loki running in your own environment, and then you also were using Grafana Cloud, you could forward to both. Maybe use the local for short-term, file storage, and then Grafana Cloud for long-term, or vice versa. You could do that. And again, so that kind of shows that sort of composability. Yeah, I guess I won't stop presenting this time. Anything else? Anything that I missed, you think?
No, that's great. One other question with the the example or demo repo that you've built, which is amazing, by the way. People should check that out. Do we know where that might land in our docs, just for the video recording?
Yeah, so
future?
that'll go under the tutorials section. So it may not be just individual. There may be a new directory, so to speak, or a new folder in here. But that's probably where that would end up.
Awesome. And this will be the last thing I'll put you on the spot if you're willing. Is I think it would be cool just to see a very quick, just what that repo looks like, what it offers
Oh,
already.
sure.
And I know it's work in progress, but I think it's
All
super
right.
useful.
So again, this is like the uh, top level. There's a little bit of who is this for. Again, I can give you the rundown on this. Actually, on this whole thing, it's basically for people who are looking to switch to flow mode and are interested in exploring it. It assumes you have like a little bit of familiarity with telemetry collection, but so far nothing in there is that complicated. I have some plans on adding new stuff in the future. Again, whether it ends up in the repo in our docs, we'll see timing wise. Talks about what flow is, what do you need to get started. This does expect that you're using, or sorry, I was using a Linux machine. This should work in Unix as well. I don't have Windows, so some of these things may not work as nicely with Windows. Apologies. Maybe that, I mean, open for contributions if someone is interested. But generally speaking, this uses like Linux and Unix style paths. It also assumes that you have Docker installed. Again, the Docker part is if you want to follow along with the examples. Obviously, you can read it just fine either way. But if you wanted to, play around and test things out, or just again follow the examples, you would need Docker um, and Docker Compose. It also assumes you have a Grafana agent binary. It just makes things easier, and there are some things that are not as nice if you run the agent inside of Docker. And by not as nice, I mean it creates a directory, and it's not as like nice in the examples to be like, hey, look at this directory that was created, rather than saying, hey, go exec bin bash in your Docker uh, container. So again, following along, just run Docker Compose up, and then don't forget to run Docker Compose down after you're done. It spins up some dependencies, and then take a look at each folder. So there's a README in each. Talks about a little brief header. There's recommended reading. So this is just links out to our docs, because again, the docs are going to be the biggest source of truth. I didn't want to rewrite all of our docs. There's no need for it. It saves me time, and is also our docs are quite nice. But generally speaking, this is like it kind of gives you a path. This is the breadcrumbs to follow. These might be good places to start. There's a little bit of like rewriting of some of our docs, so that it isn't just like, hey, go here and read this. But we start getting into our, what things are, pro tips, little visual guides, and then again, this is where you would follow along. You could copy paste this into a config, and then run the agent that you have, and you should be able to see things coming up. Yeah, and then there's like a little exercise, generally speaking, at the end, saying, what if we modify the things that we previously saw into something that does this? And then again, there's a full config. I won't spoil this one, but there is a like the answer for it as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, for anybody who likes to do hands-on learning, like myself, there's probably no better way to get off the ground with Flow. So check it out. All right, thanks for bearing with me there, Misha, on the fly. I appreciate that. And if nobody else has any questions, I don't see any in the chat or any hands raised. I think we're good to go. So last call. All right, very cool. Thanks, everybody. I'm gonna kill the recording. And thank you, Misha.
Thanks, everyone.